Okay, we're started now. And this is the second tape. It's still January 16th of 1993. And you were just talking about...
Janice Ostrander.
Yes, and you're talking about when Jenny came out about 1906, 7, 8, or
Yeah.
when... You said when Carl was in high school.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she visited. She came out several summers. And we were also going to say the names of the Dad's brothers and sisters. Or you have that?
Yes, we talked about that. But you were going to mention Janice Ostrander.
There you go. Well, at any rate, she was 4 years old, so I think she was born in 1902 or 3.
You, Janice?
Janice Ostrander.
Okay.
And she was the daughter of Jenny Durkee and her husband, Carlton Ostrander. He was a music teacher in Denver and quite outstanding there. And they lived there in Denver, but of course they couldn't make any money.
Now, are you speaking of... This is Jenny that was born in 1902 or 3.
Janice was born in 19...
Okay.
Jenny was about... Jenny is the girl there on the bike.
Right.
And she was about 14 on that picture. And I think that she undoubtedly...
Can I take this picture down?
Yeah, that's okay. Undoubtedly was about I would say that she would be, she was 14 there.
Jenny
Durkee
is on your father's right, which is on our left.
And this is May Durkee.
Do you want to hold that up a little bit?
May never married. She was a businesswoman in Chicago all her life until she retired and went to California to live. And she lived with Jenny out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that undoubtedly this was taken possibly about the year or so after I was born, about 98 or 99 or possibly 1900.
Okay. Christine, your father's sister, was quite a bit older than your father.
She was, Aunt Jenny was, Annie was 3 years older than Dad, and Aunt Christine was 5 years older than Dad. Dad was born in 60.
And so Christine would have been in 55.
He was born in 55.
And Jenny...
And then there were 2 older sisters, Britta and Anna Britta. And they were young girls in Houston. And I don't know which was which, but the one of them married a brother of Pete Bengtson, who was our cousin. Pete Bengtson was the only one of that family that came to Longmont and visited us. But he came right out from Houston. And I think we visited with him at least twice.
Pete Bengtson?
And Bengtson.
He was your first cousin?
No, he was Dad's. See, his
would he have been Britta?
He was second cousin. He was second cousin to us, just like Louis Nelson's young people.
Oh.
Because his, or was he? I think maybe he was on the first generation. So he was the cousin. Pete Bengtson was Mrs. Nelson's brother. And his daughter...
Mrs. Nelson's brother.
Mrs. Louis Nelson, who was Emma and Herbert's and Carl's mother. She was...
Your Uncle Louis?
No, Louis Nelson. He was the husband of Dad's cousin Anna.
He was your dad's brother-in-law, Louis Nelson. Yes.
No, Anna was Dad's cousin.
I'm sorry.
So Louis Nelson was his cousin.
And that's the one that saw the picture of your grandfather on the mantle.
Yeah, she says, that's my uncle.
Okay, Anna was your cousin. And
My dad's cousin.
Your dad's cousin is located near Longmont.
Yeah, and so all of those Nelsons. And then, of course, Louis Nelson had two brothers, Gust and August. August lived just cat a corner from that on the big nice house out on the way to Risby Church. And in that family there was Amelia and her sister, older Anna, I believe. And then there were Arthur and August and John and there was one more for that. And they, some of them in the family were married, but some weren't. And August married Louise Johansson, our classmate out in Pella School. So we were closely connected, and every time I went out to Longmont, I either talked to them on the phone or visited with them. And we visited with August and Louise a lot. And that's one reason why Joanne is Joanne Louise, because your dad admired Louise Johansson very much. Her father and mother were Danish, and most of the people in the community snorted at him, laughed at him. He didn't exactly know where he belonged. But at any rate, now where were we?
Okay, I want to review once again. Your father's cousin Anna
came on the boat from Sweden with Dad.
And her father was?
I don't know.
Anna's father would have been you don't remember who that would have been? The brother, that would have been a brother of your grandfather.
Yeah, he would have been grandfather's brother.
You don't remember his name?
No, I don't. I don't know. Because we had, as far as I can remember, we had no connections with them at all.
You would have heard, of course, but you'd forgotten maybe.
Yeah. And Anna and Anna-Britta, one of them married Pete Benson's brother, and one of them married another Benson who was a little distant away, not in the immediate family.
Okay.
But both of those women died. The one died in childbirth, and the other one died of pneumonia.
Okay.
And they were just young women in their early 20s.
Okay, before I forget it, I'd like to get back a little more to Jenny Durkee before I forget. She would have been considerably older than you or your brothers.
She would have been, I think that she would have been less than 5 years older than George. I don't think she would have been that much younger.
She could have been born in like 85 maybe?
That would have made her 3 years older than George.
Let's speculate that.
You can say.
Then
say that.
Then Anne Christine was like 30 years old. Anne Christine was born in 1855. And let's just speculate that.
Yeah, she was, yeah, that's right.
And when you can speculate that Jenny would have been born in 85, and then her daughter Janice was born in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
Perhaps when Jenny was just in early 20s or late teens or 20s.
She was quite young when she had her.
Okay, that makes sense. And you were saying earlier that Janice died just 4 months ago. You think? She
lived. She had come up. I think she had been living in California in the cities, one of the cities there on the coast. I don't remember just which one, but she had apparently come to visit. I don't think that she had come out to visit. She had visited with Martha Somerville, but she didn't die there. She died in Los Angeles area.
Okay.
But at any rate, they were closely related.
Were there any other children of Jenny? That was the only
No.
daughter, only child?
Uh,
Did Janice Ostrander have any children?
uh,
You know? Did she marry?
That I just don't know at all. I'll tell you, I have a pretty extensive genealogy out in the basement of Norman's.
Okay.
And everything up until the last 5 years or so has been recorded pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
In that Edith and I, after Edith was gone, I tried to keep up, but I don't think I succeeded as well as she, but she kept pretty good records.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I just wanted to ask that.
Mm-hmm. But as long as you have that genealogy of them, you'll be able to find, you'll associate dates and names pretty well, so that you can straighten out a whole lot of things that I'm not able to do now without any records in front of me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Have we finished that topic, you think? Have we finished that topic?
I think we can.
I was going to ask you about some of your early days in Longmont. I was going to ask you about your neighbors and the Risby Church and your school. What did you call your school?
Pella.
Pella School?
Pella School.
Would you tell
And
us where?
Pella was named for that, that locality in Iowa, Pella, Iowa. It was a well-known name among schools. There must have been some outstanding localities with good schools in the middle states here, because there were a number of Pella School in Nebraska. There was a Pella School then in Iowa, and a Pella School in Colorado.
Was it a type of education, or was it a type of school book system, or do you know?
I just think that they were areas where they had successful teachers who were capable of leading the young people. And Miss Catherine Davis was one of those persons. The boys used to get so disgusted with her because she was such a rabid Democrat. But when she was talking politics, she was always talking good sense. And she was very outstanding in explaining political situations or just about anything in history. And in Colorado, she knew Colorado history pretty well.
You say that the boys were upset with her because she was a staunch Democrat. You said the boys were upset with her because she was a staunch Democrat. What boys are you speaking of? Your brothers?
My brothers, yeah.
Well, yeah, but they were students of her.
They were her students. And they never argued or did then, but they just didn't care to have her propound her special understanding of the Democrat Party.
In those days, teachers editorialized,
Yeah,
and even newspapers did.
yeah,
They don't do that as much now.
no.
In fact, they're discouraged because that's not the public forum. A school teacher should not use a classroom
No,
for opinion.
no, just because she and her family had run for political office, she shouldn't have taught politics at all. She should have been able to keep her mouth shut.
But notwithstanding that, she was an outstanding teacher, you would say.
But as far as teaching little children and all the way through 8th grade,
Mhm.
I know that she did a splendid job. I know that your dad, I told you that she had a name for him, Old Perfection.
Oh, perfection.
That the whole school knew that Bengtson was Old Perfection.
You told me earlier that he went early to the school to start the furnace.
Yeah, school took up at 9, and he was always there before 8 o'clock. So you see, he had done his work at home between 6 and 6:30, and by 7:45, he was well on his way to school. We lived little over a mile east of school, and he walked over there.
Okay, the school was east, you say?
Mhm.
Wait a minute now.
The school was
West?
west of us,
On the way toward Friedrichs.
beyond Fristrom's. The next turn, the
What can I get for you?
Pella School's right here on the table somewhere.
You want me to stop the... Well, here we'll go.
I'll see if I can find it real rapidly.
And it was a mile west of your farm?
And the schoolhouse was about a mile and a quarter. I looked at it, I saw it just this morning. I just don't know exactly where to look for it.
Well, we can stop it just a little bit, or you can...
I just don't know exactly where to look for it.
Was it a picture?
It's a picture, yeah. Picture of Pella School. You've seen it here in recent days, but you haven't paid much attention to it. It's an old stucco building.
Okay, we'll get it on picture a little later. And it was west of your farm, past the Friedstrom's.
It's just beyond Friedstrom's farm.
Is the site still there, Edna? The school site?
They torn down the building, and I think that the little plot has gone into the farm that was there.
What side of the road was it on?
On the north side. You know, as we went from our place, we went a little bit south, then we turned west, and then we turned and went crosswise until we got to the Davies farm, and then we went directly west, and then we turned a little bit, and there was Pella School. And as we had turned west here, there was the Friedstrom farm right there.
Yes.
And then out beyond that, up on the hill a little on the rise, was the McCaslin place, and down below on the creek bottom was the Forbes farm.
And they were all good friends of your family?
They were all good friends. And right here at the corner where we turned and went to Pella School, that's where the Johansons lived, where August Nelson's wife lived.
How many years did Catherine Davis teach at that school?
She taught, she left the year Edith was in the 8th grade. She left then because Edith's 8th grade teacher was Luella Henry, and she was from Niwot.
From where?
Niwot. Niwot is a little town south of us.
Oh.
On the road to Boulder.
And
so that would have been about 19, what? 6, 7, 8?
I finished in 1914 or 13, and Edith must have finished in 1910.
1910.
And Edith, of course, got through school at the proper time, but I had interruptions too much, so that I should have finished a year sooner than I did.
How many years do you think, or when would Catherine Davis have started teaching at Pella? When the boys were younger? Did all the boys have her?
All of us in our family had her. And Catherine Davis, I think, George was born in 1908. She was a young lady then.
George was born in 88?
In 88, yeah. And I have an idea that she finished high school. She had taught at Pella School 5-6 years at least before George and Carl were there.
She must have taught there over 10 years at Pella School.
Oh yeah, she taught, I think she had been, when she left, she had taught there about 15 years or so.
So was she a young woman in her 20s, early 30s maybe?
I think let's see, George was born in 88. I think that she was born, I think not later than the middle of 70s. Earlier than that, I think she was born in the early 70s. So that she was at least 15 years older than George.
Did she room at a farm home there in the area? Where did she, during the school year?
She drove out from town. She lived with her father and her brother, Roy Davis. They lived near the Collier School. She drove with her horse and buggy.
Every day?
Every day.
And that was what, 2 or 3 miles?
Took care of her horse.
Wasn't that 2 or 3 miles?
It was from Collier Street out to us. It was more than 3 miles. It was close to 4, so that she drove 5 miles in the morning.
In an open carriage?
And then home at night.
It would have been an open carriage? Or
Well, before we were there, I don't know, because it was close to the river, so there were lots of trees around us. But across the road, the Swilkies lived, and then on up across the St. Vrain, Little St. Vrain, and over the little bridge of the Little St. Vrain, and then a little farther the bridge over the St. Vrain. On the east side was the Turner's place, and on the west side over here was the Zweck place, and a little farther over was another Turner place, and I forgot what the name of the people that lived on the corner, but they had a girl in school too that was the same age as Edith. So that there was a whole crowd of students that had come from right there at the crossroads. Then to the west of us, there was the Basher place, and then the Davies place, and then the Fristroms, and then the Johansson, and then the McCaslin and Forbes, which was beyond the schoolhouse.
Now, each one of those families had several children in school.
Oh yeah, and most of the families had 5 and 6 children.
So, at that time, Pella School, what would it have had? 15, 20, 25 students?
Oh,
can you guess?
I remember one year very definitely. We were 33 one year, and I think that we were from 30 to 33 was about standard size. I don't think it was until several years later that we were less than 30s into the 20s. And then gradually, then it became schools for the beat tenders.
I see.
And of lesser standard.
The beat
and
tenders.
From off in that direction there was the Olden. The Oldens were Norwegians, and Alfred Olson and George were the same age. And a little farther down was one of the Beckwith places, and then another farm there, which was just north of Louis Nelson's.
Okay. Now, she drove out one way, 5 miles every morning.
Every morning.
Now, undoubtedly, Edna, there were times when the snow was deep. Did she just go through the snow?
She what?
There was undoubtedly times when there was a lot of snow on that road.
Yeah, that she couldn't go of it. And there was only one telephone in the community, and that was at Klein's, the first place east of the schoolhouse, and the first place west was McCaslin's.
Okay, I'm going to ask then. There were times when she couldn't even make it to school. What happened when all the children arrived? Did they just go home?
Well, most of them were wise enough not to start.
In a storm?
It was bad weather, and they didn't believe that she could make it, so they just didn't try it.
And on days like that, my dad wouldn't even go up and make this fire. I mean, it was a judgment, would you say?
There were times when he didn't go either because he knew the weather was just too bad.
So it was just kind of a judgment call for everyone. There are no phones to call anyone.
I think so. I think they just used their common sense more than anything else.
Of course, they didn't have blizzards there like we do in the plains.
Oh,
What, right?
It was so vastly different from what it is now.
The snow, you didn't have the wind storms, did you?
There would be times when we'd have wind, but not Kansas windstorms.
Okay.
Because you see, we were too close to the mountains.
You were on the east side of the mountains, and there wasn't as much snow there, was there?
No, not too much. We were too close to the foothills.
Uh-huh.
The storm would pass over us and hit down
So
15 miles or so east of us.
So you
out
didn't.
of Platteville and those towns.
So heavy snow was not a real problem for you, was it?
But driving with horses, the fathers of the children would say, well, she can't possibly drive her horse out here in this kind of weather.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Was there a shed for her horse to stay in?
There was a shed where her horse was tied.
And you say my dad helped take care of the horse, feed him and everything?
Yeah, he fed and watered it and took care of it.
Was there just a well?
And put on the harness.
At the school, was there a pump well for water?
I don't think we had pumps, we had cisterns.
Cistern.
They hauled in good fresh water to the cisterns and then we turned it up.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
And they'd carry in a couple buckets of water to the schoolhouse and we could drink there with a dipper.
Sure. And you had coal heat in a stove, or was it wood?
Coal heat, yeah. We had some wood too because we were right close to the river down below the hill, and we could cut wood there, the trees, and carry up blocks of wood, and they'd use in that also.
Who did that?
It wasn't always all coal.
Okay, who did that? The fathers in the summertime, or who did that? The students?
I think there were 3 school directors.
And they
were the ones that saw to that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any of the clients were asked to do any of that.
Mm-hmm.
But Mr. Johansson, Mr. Forbes, and Mr. McCaslin, they were the 3 that looked after those things.
They were on the school board.
They were on the school board.
Okay, I'm curious about this early education in the school. You say it was a stucco building?
It was huge blocks of rock like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they were laid on each other, and then it was overlaid with stucco on the outside and on the inside. And the wall on the inside, you could scratch there and scratch your name if you liked, and so on.
And I'm sure there were a few names scratched in.
There were a lot of them, but it was made pretty well. But it was beginning to get pretty old, so there were many cracks, and there was a lot of gusts of winds that would come in, especially in the corners.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember being cold in that school building?
I don't have any recollection that we ever were miserably cold. I think the one who took care of the fire was pretty sure that there was sufficient heat in there. Mm-hmm. And then toward the afternoon, let the fire go down gradually. But they left it in such a shape that it would be warm next morning.
Oh, they banked the fire.
They banked it in such a way that it wouldn't die out completely till early morning hours.
So when my dad came, there was coals to start a new fire?
He did, but it wasn't too dreadfully cold.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like being outdoors or anything like it.
Okay, and there were, with 30 students, there would have been quite a crowd in that room, because it couldn't have been too large.
Yeah, the one year when there were several of the beet tenders' children there, I think we had approximately 40 students in the fall then for a few weeks.
Did each student have a desk, or did they share desks?
They,
Do you recall?
well, I can remember that most of the places, if it was large enough, there would be sit 2 at a desk, and then there were some that drilled. But I remember also that usually was 1 or 2 that sat up close to the teacher's desk because there was no space left over.
At a table?
And that would be one of the oldest girls that would sit at a table or on the recitation bench, but had her books on the teacher's desk.
Did the older students ever help assisting with the younger ones?
Oh, you mean...
in teaching, assistant teaching?
The older girls helped all the time. They were, Jenny McCaslin, and then Louise Johansson, and then it came to Mabel Spencer and Edith, and they all helped with the little folks. There were just too many.
Sure.
And the ones that she could rely on, she'd ask them, and they'd take the little youngsters off in a corner, and they would have class with them.
The most important, of course, is reading and writing, and then arithmetic.
And arithmetic, yeah.
If they got the basics, they didn't worry so much.
Then when they got up to the 5th grade, then they began to take Colorado history and United States history, and like that. They had books that, and then I can remember when we first got a physiology, we got a book, Anatomy, Physiology, and Hygiene was the name of a little book. We had that. And then we had books that went on from there, so we got better knowledge. But we studied. One book was How to Keep Well. That was the name of the book.
Uncle George used to speak of a certain reader. What kind of reader? McGuffey's reader or something like that?
Well, McGuffey's, we didn't have them out there, but Dad read in McGuffey's readers.
Okay.
So you see that it was the common reader back at that time, but we had Sears, C-Y-R, Sears readers, and I think we had 5 of them. First, second, third, fourth, and 5th grade readers. And the 5th reader was for the students in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. The others followed the chronological setup pretty well.
Okay. Was there a piano in the school?
In my day, I don't think we had a piano, but we had an old organ.
A pump organ?
Somebody had given their organ, and it was in use a great deal. And the teacher would play the organ mostly, and then it came that some of the older girls were able to play the organ and help out.
Did you have a time during the day when you would sing, just sing as like patriotic songs or American songs, or did you have a time when music was part of the day?
We always sang. I think we always sang when they started school in the morning, and we nearly always sang at noon, but sang always in the morning. And
what would you sing, for example?
huh?
What would you sing, for example? America or
Oh yeah.
what songs? Patriotic songs?
We learned to sing all of the old plantation songs, and Old Kentucky Home, and all of those. We sang all of those, and then we sang a few others, but we sang. We had religious songs, and we sang quite a lot of those that were well known with the children in the Methodist Church in Hygiene, and we learned them if we didn't already know them, but we learned them readily, and we sang quite a lot of those.
Okay.
And they're songs that we still sing.
Now I'm going to ask you, did you have like socials or get-togethers during the school, like Christmas programs, or?
We had programs at Christmas. Every Christmas we had, but I can't remember that we began to have any social events. I think maybe we'd had, other than the Christmas program, we had nothing social events while Miss Davis was there. But I think that the next year when Miss Geither came, and she wasn't a well lady at all, and she died before the end of the school year.
Oh,
she had, I think she had TB, but she was a very nice person, and she had come from Ohio, and
what was her name again, Miss
Geither,
Geither?
Clara Geither. But she just was there that one. The last 3 weeks, the teacher was Blanche, oh, I can't say what name, but she was a Kansas girl, and she had gone to school in western Kansas. So she was from one of these towns somewhere between here and the Colorado boundary. I remember we liked her awfully well, and we especially liked her because she was well dressed. Lou Hovius taught there, and her mother was a hygiene lady. And I can tell you exactly what she wore. The first 2 weeks, she wore a black and white checked gingham jumper with a white blouse. Then the next week, she wore a light blue skirt and a white blouse. Then the fourth and fifth week, she went back to this black and white checked jumper. And then the 6th week, she wore this blue. By that time, you see, we were in the middle of October. If it was a nice year, she would go back to the jumper again for another 2 weeks. But if the snows the cold weather had already come, then she had when the first week she wore, she had a dark green skirt and a green plaid flannel blouse, and it was made so that the cross beams on it were this way, and it was tucked down here. It was an awfully pretty outfit. She wore that every day from the time she started to wear it through Christmas and January and February, excepting on 2 or 3 occasions when she wore a black skirt with a black blouse with short sleeves. And then she went back to the jumper again.
In spring. In spring. And this is Blanche, you say? This was Blanche? Or which teacher was this?
Blanche, what was her name?
But you say even though she only had 2 outfits for each season, you still thought she looked nice in her clothes, attractive clothes.
She was a very attractive person, and she never looked poorly clad.
Even though she wore the same thing every day,
no.
And no one ever made any comments.
No, they once in a while they'd say something, but nothing really ugly and stringent or anything.
Even though she only had 2 outfits, she was not ashamed.
And she lived up near Hygiene with her mother and stepfather, right close to Hygiene. So she would walk down a little over a mile down from Hygiene.
Okay, tell me about Hygiene. Was that a little community?
That was a little town on the railroad. We always went from Longmont through Hygiene up to Lyons. That was the end of the railroad.
Okay, Hygiene was only a mile from Pella School?
A little over a mile north.
How many would have lived there in that community?
In
Hygiene?
In Hygiene? Well, I'll tell you, they lived on both sides of the street for a whole mile. And at the end of the mile was the Pella School, or the Hygiene School.
That is a high school?
On that corner.
Was that a high school or
it was a grade school. And it wasn't until the last 2 years we lived out there that they got into the 9th and 10th grades. And then they went to Longmont High.
So if there had not, if Pella School wouldn't have been there, you would have gone into Hygiene for school.
If what?
If the Pella School hadn't have been there in the country, all those children would have gone into Hygiene.
They'd all had to go into Hygiene. And if they went to hygiene, they had to come not only to hygiene, but another mile up north to where the hygiene schoolhouse was.
Oh, I see.
And a teacher there, a couple of the teachers that they liked so well were the Swedish girls from Don Risby way.
Why?
And they had gone to school in Niwot.
And that's a town south of you.
That was south of us.
Why didn't they put the school in the community? Why did they build a school in hygiene a mile north?
Because the Gosses, who were the politicians, and some of those others, they lived, their farms were up north here. So they built the schoolhouse within range of their homes. And most of them lived within a mile of the schoolhouse. And the hygiene students lived within a mile.
Sure.
And those that lived south of hygiene, across the railroad track, they came on down to Pella School.
Okay, you said that they lived a whole mile on the side of the street. Was that the main street?
That was the main street.
And that ran north and south?
That went from the
Right.
street. The road came out from town, and it was a mile and a quarter north of us. And it went over the hill and on down until it got to the road that was the hygiene road, and then turned and went. And we went up there that mile, and then we turned west and went another mile or so west, and then we got to Advent Town.
But before we get to Advent Town, I want to talk to hygiene again. Which direction did the railroad go? West?
The railroad came in slantwise. They came in from town. This was the Burlington. Came out from town and came slantwise, and it crossed. Let's see, the Turners lived here north of us at the corner, and the Zwecks over here, and then there were the Spalls lived over here. But the people in those houses, there was movement there all the time. But the Turners and the Zwecks had been old timers, and they stayed there. They were still there 15 years after we had left. The next generation.
Okay. I have some more questions about the hygiene, but anyway, the main street didn't parallel the railroad tracks.
Yeah.
Or did it?
See, when the railroad came in here, and the depot was right here at the south edge of town, then it turned slightly so that it didn't go into Advent Town, but it was just slightly west of it, and then went right on up, made another little turn, and into Lyons.
Okay, Advent Town, was that smaller than hygiene?
Oh yeah, much smaller. It was a mile long, and there wasn't a house for every lot by any means. But I imagine that on that mile that there were perhaps 6 or 8 houses on either side of it.
Approximately, how large would hygiene have been? Was it been several hundred maybe, or less than 100 people?
No, I don't think so. I would think that maybe there were in the mile on the west side there were perhaps 6 or 8 homes, and on the east side the same, possibly 1 or 2 more, and then where the road came in from the west that passed the cemetery here, it came and it was at least a block north of the railroad tracks.
Was it an ethnic settlement? Was it like Russian or Swedish, or was it a mixture?
No, the people up there, I think the predominance was Irish, because there were McCaslins, several McCaslin families, and the boys, the McCaslin young people, they went to high school in town. They were good friends of the family. But Matt was the only one that lived in our district. In town was Walter McCaslin, the banker, who was Dad's one of his best friends, but he had no children, he and his wife. And then, let's see, McClung's, see, that's Irish. and one of the McCaslins married a McClung, I know, and then there was a McIntosh, that would be Irish too, wouldn't it? So it was largely of an Irish settlement, although the Bashers were English, and they tended to come down from this area, and but there were Alpheus Basher was the auctioneer, and he was very outstanding in his work. They all recognized him, and then there were I should be able to say some of the other names. I know a couple of the Bashers married the girls from down towards Risby. One of my very good friends up at Fort Collins was one of the Basher girls, and her mother was Swedish as she could be from out that way. So you see, they had, by the time when they were beginning to get cars and could move out a little, then just like it was here, there was just too much intermarriage. But as soon as they were able to get out a little farther, then they got into these other communities and intermarried there.
Otherwise, the only people to marry were cousins.
Well, there were a number that married, but what happened was the girls would get jobs away from home as soon as possible, and they'd go to town, and after they'd been working in town a couple of years, they'd find somebody there that say married. So a lot of the girls married outside. There weren't. It wasn't as prevalent as it was out here in Fremont, because here they had to go all the way to Salina to get outside of it.
Were there any stores in Hygiene?
Yes, there was the Moody's store, and there was the Early's one of them. I know there were at least 3 stores there, and they were pretty good stores, and they carried the books, and they carried groceries.
General stores?
And, yeah, and they had a small amount of dry goods, a few things. The necessary things for pioneer families. I imagine the Hygiene stores was as good as any of the stores that were in Algona, Iowa, in those days.
Are you getting tired, Edna?
No, I'm not worn out at all.
We'll go another 5 minutes. I'm going to have to leave here pretty soon.
Yeah,
Can we do this again next week? Would you like
we
to?
can do it again next week.
Okay.
I don't know anything at all that would hinder.
I have some
And
more.
we can go out and eat again.
Can we do that? And I'd like to ask a little more about the school, like your activities, and like recess and your games. And you were talking about every Friday afternoon that Miss Davis had you do you spell down or some kind of games to get you to think.
I will. You mentioned it, and you said games. It wasn't until Clara Gaither was there that we got interested in trying to contact other schools, and so it wasn't until a year after that that we ever played out beyond our own group.
Okay.
We played within, but it was their older brothers and sisters were going to high school, and they were learning that we can go outside and get groups of students and play them.
But you played games within your own group, of course. And I want to hear.
They played it. And I can remember that in Miss Davis's day, pum pum pull away was the common. It was easy. They'd run back and forth, back and forth. It was a good, lively game. And then they got, little by little, their parents would tell them of other games that they had played elsewhere. And they were learning, and they were bringing them in.
How large was your playground? Would it have been an acre or so?
Well, I'll tell you, our playground was kind of funny. There was the Pella Ditch. It had, let's see, it had come from up beyond Spencer's and had fallen right at the edge of the, there was a rise of ground there. So that it was right on the top edge. They had made the ditch, and right here, it turned the corner, and then it got down into the farmland. So Johansson's and Fridstrom's, they got their irrigation water out of Pellades. But up here, it was just coming from a source higher up. Now, if it was beyond Spencer's, it was somewhere on up the line, and I don't know. There was the old McCaslin, Grandpa McCaslin's place that was down on the low level up there, and we used to go up there for picnics, and that was at least a mile or a mile and a half up there, so we were able to walk there. But over this way, as we turned the corner here at Johansson's, the Pellades turned, and then it became merchandise. That's what it amounted to. That Johansson's irrigated from it, and all of these, the Fristroms and the Davises and all of them, they all got water from Pellades. And farther down, see, our land was, it was 160 acres, and then there was 40 acres. The 40 acres was down here, 106, 200 acres. And then, so that this 40 was not attached to anything, but there was the Niwot ditch that came here, and we got water from the Niwot ditch for this 40 acre down here.
Did the Pellades go through your other farm?
No, the Pellades went farther south.
Oh.
But the closest one that we got to this water up there was just this. We had a 10 acre of alfalfa here, and then beyond that I think was a beet field. I think that's the way it was. And then up this way it was alfalfa and wheat, and then there was pasture. We had a good bit of pasture. The St. Rain came in about a quarter of a mile from our northeast corner, and then it swung along here. So we had a whole lot of water in that corner of our land. And when the heavy rains came in the spring, all of that was usually underwater. So that that way the grassland was irrigated, and it made beautiful pasture for the cattle.
And Edna, I think we'd like to stop right now. We'll continue next week, can we? At this
5
point?
minutes to 3, yeah.
5 minutes of 3. Okay.
Well.
Okay, we're recording now, Edna. It's January 23rd. It's 1:30 in the afternoon, January 23rd, 1993. And we just had a good lunch at the Swedish Crown. And we were visiting last week about 2 important things that I would like you to follow up on. Your mother's side of the family, and then we talked about the Pella School. We started talking about the Pella School and daily activities of a day, and you were maybe going to talk about a day at school. So you just go ahead, and then as you visit, I may have some questions. Whatever you'd like to talk about.
I had some pictures of these relatives in Chicago on Dad's side, and I'll have them out so that if I don't pick them up today, we'll do it next Saturday.
Okay.
But we're back in Mother's territory now. And I don't remember how much we talked about it, but I know that they came to the United States from Västergötland.
From Västergötland.
From Västergötland. I see. Anyway, it's near Fall Chipping, and the congregation is all pictured there. Grulanda. Grulanda is the name of the church where she was baptized and confirmed.
Your mother?
Yeah, and
Okay.
they.
Here, I'll let you hold this picture up. I don't know if it'll show much.
Kyrkvägar på Tallboden. Ruth and Lee visited there when they were in Sweden the last time, and this little one says Välkommen till Grulanda kyrka.
Okay.
And Gruland, it's one of the many congregations in the area. And this is a picture of the location.
Okay. I may show a close-up of that later.
I'll point out, I'll have to find Grulanda. I have number 6 there. There must be a lot of churches in the area, because I see here that Floby, Kinneved, Brismene, Gäla, Slöta, Karlebo, Högstena, Friggeråker, and Uglum, and so on. There are, I imagine that there are close to 20 churches in this
Okay.
locality,
What's
which is close, and St. Olaf's Church there. And here's Mr. Berg was a kind of a resort place. Mother was there once, and it was a delightful area, and she enjoyed it so immensely.
What is the closest large town?
Well, Falköping.
Falköping.
And it is north of, see, we talked about Dad's country in Holland, and Holland is right along the coast at the south edge of Sweden is Holland, and then Skåne and Blekinge. And then by that time, then you get around to the east side and come up the east coast, and going north from Holland, I don't remember, I'm not sure if it mother's or your mother's province was Västmanland, which was a couple provinces farther north, and then on up to northern Sweden. And all of the provinces in Sweden have names that mean something, like Västmanland, Södermanland, Southman, and Norrbotten. Botten, that means an ice-covered area.
Okay, Västmanland, is that Westman's land?
Västmanland. Yeah.
What did that mean, Westman?
Yeah, men of the West.
Okay.
And then farther north there was Jämtland, and see, it was down below the mountains. It was even land.
Oh.
When you translate it correctly. But all of Sweden they all have a real fine interpretation, excepting that I don't quite understand what Medelpad is. It's the middle of something.
So your mother's people were from close to...
Yeah, Västergötland. Västergötland.
What does that mean?
Western Goth. See, all of the Göta, they're people of the Gothic
Tribes?
They're all Gothic.
In your history, Edna.
And you see that the Goths, they were over even into the English territory, farther west and so on.
Sweden was developed very early, wasn't it?
Apparently so.
What do you say, 5th, 6th century maybe, or something?
And let's see, Charles the 12th 12th, you see. There have been a number of Charles before him, and I think that was almost 2 centuries ago that he was the king of Sweden. So you see that Sweden had been established. I haven't looked up on Swedish history, although I know it real well, so I can't say any of the dates now. But Gustavus Adolphus, I think, was king of Sweden about the time of our Civil War.
I think he was before that.
You think he was a little earlier?
I think so.
I'm not too sure.
I remember reading about that too. But Sweden was always fighting with Denmark or Finland, or they had wars.
There's an awful lot to Swedish history, and I haven't checked up on any of it for several years. 15 years at least since I read any Swedish history. But in my day, I knew Swedish history real well. But I can't say dates anymore.
Okay, so getting back to your mother's family, you talked earlier in the restaurant about the order of the children. Can you talk about that some?
Let's see, they came on a boat that was not seaworthy, and it seems to me like it took them 16 days to cross the Atlantic, something like that. So that it was a pretty lengthy trip, and it was remarkable. Mother said it was remarkable that the ship held together as well as it did, and it was the last journey it ever took.
Oh, really?
And all of Mother's relatives that came at that time came on that boat. There was a whole slew of them. I don't know how many. And I rather think that they all must have come to Omaha because there were relatives already established in Omaha. And I don't know what name they went by or anything like that. But I do know that they spent at least, they must have come in the fall and spent that whole winter in Omaha. And then by next spring, I think Mother had gone to Algona, Iowa, where she was employed by this Mrs. Blossom, who had well, it was something like a delicatessen. It was a little better than just a plain eating place. It was more than that. And I think it was rather well established. I can't remember much of anything that she ever said about it, but I do know that the men that, like Dad's men, who drove that long distance into town, that they ate at these places, and undoubtedly that's how Dad and Mother got acquainted, that he went in there to eat. But I don't know that I ever asked or anything. So many of those things that children just take for granted. And of course now, had Mother lived another 10 years, I would have just heaped questions on her and learned a lot more. But I was still too young. And Edith had asked some, but not, I don't know that she ever made any notation. And I'm sure that in George's belongings, he had notations that had, because he was one that would ask questions. Now, I'm sure that Carl didn't have any. I don't know that he ever talked, that we ever talked. I suppose that did a little, but I can't remember talking to him much of anything. Even when we had visited in Denell, in the grandmother's old home, which was a lovely little cottage, just about 3/4 of a mile north of Denell, so it had close to town.
Are any of those buildings still living? I'm sorry. Still, are any of those buildings still existing?
Last time I was in Denell, Edith and I, that was when we drove, and we were in Denell, and Edith drove, and I think that we kind of had our eyes open to locate grandmother's place, but we didn't find anything there. I think it had all, it had been absorbed by a larger place, and so those buildings weren't there anymore.
Okay.
But you see that it had been established.
Now that would have, excuse me, that would have been Gustav and Maria Elena's farm. Your grandparents, Gustav Nilsson and Maria Elena, or Maria
Elena Nilsson. And of course, they were all from Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
And the children in that family were John, and then Sanford. He went by the name of Fred mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Sanfrid in Swedish. And then mother. And then I think that the next one must have been the little girl that died, Hilma. And she was just a little girl when she died. And I scarcely heard them even talk about her, so I know next to nothing. But the next one, younger than mother, then, was Frank. Did I say Sanford? I said John and Sanford and mother. And then Frank Nelson and then Elida, mother's sister, who was 10 years younger than mother, and she never married. And then the youngest brother was Carl.
Okay.
And Carl remained on the old home place in Dunell until I think they went out to Dickinson, South Dakota, North Dakota.
Do you have any idea what year that might have been that they homesteaded or went out to Dickinson?
Well, I can remember when they left Dunell and moved out there. So I would judge that I would have been at least 8, 9 years old before it really would give me much of an impression on me. But mother was still living.
So it could have been like in 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in those years?
See, mother died in June of 19. Did she die in 1915?
No, I thought you said 13 or 14.
Let's see. I was still in school. I didn't finish, and I finished the 8th grade when I was 14. So she would have had to have died sooner than that.
I think one time you said 1913.
1913 is more logical. And at that time, she died on the 13th of June. Then, see, I would have been 12 and 3. I wouldn't. I've been about 12 years old. Yeah, I think so. 12, going on 13.
Were you born in 97?
In 97, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
then you would have been 15,
10.
going on 16.
I was approaching that.
Okay.
And I hadn't finished the 8th grade yet because of mother's illness. Our schooling was pretty spasmodic. Edith had managed to get through in 1910, but we made a real sacrifice in order to keep her in school, and she missed a lot of school, but she was able, with a good teacher like Catherine Davis, who understood the situation, she helped her as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So by that time, everything worked out nicely.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. There's much that I could tell that would make much sense at that early time. I know then that after they had left Omaha and gone up to the Lake Fremont area, and the Hellstroms were their neighbors, they lived there for a number of years, and then they must have moved to Dunell undoubtedly there was railroad land that opened up there.
Mm-hmm.
See, Mother and Dad were married in 87.
Mm-hmm.
George was born in 88.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 87. And and that was in Martin County, and the whole area was called Blooming Prairie.
Oh.
Blooming Prairie.
Hmm.
And
where were they married?
Huh?
Where did you say they were married? Your parents?
They were married on the 27th of August, 1887.
Okay. And where were they married?
And they were married, well, they must have been married in Algona.
The county seat.
I can't, the pictures and everything, of course, were taken by a photographer.
Were they married in church there, or were they married in...
You know, that's another thing that I can't answer very definitely, because if we were curious enough to ask, and if Mother just said something in passing and just let it go at that. You know, youngsters, when they hadn't experienced anything like that, they weren't curious enough to ask about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've thought of that I wasn't curious enough to ask a lot of things. Had it been 5 or 10 years later, I would have asked a lot of questions that are still unanswered. But then...
Now at that time, your father would have been 27 years old.
Going on 27.
His birthday was October...
See, I'll tell you, both of their birthdays were in September, and this was in August, so that they were practically the next age. So instead of being 26 and 22, they were just on the verge of being 27 and 23.
Well, now at that time, was your father farming? Was he farming?
He was, see, grandfather, by that time, see, grandfather died in 91. So you see, he wasn't able to do much farm work.
He was slowing down?
And Dad was doing the farming of the place.
Did he live with his parents on the place?
I can remember Mother talking about the marriage on a few things in regard to it. I think they must have been married right there at home, that the pastor came there, because he said that Dad played with the young people, played the games, and of course she sat primly, properly like a bride should, and her dress was black with some white ornamentation on it. I know there's the picture that you have seen here somewhere. She had a peculiar scarf here that was knotted in, and she had a little white ornament in her head with a white lace.
And she had a black dress?
A black dress. And you know, that black dress, it was very nice stuff. It was a lined skirt, and she was buried in the skirt of her wedding dress. I know that, looking back, I never asked anybody, but I know that that was the case. It had been made over, and she didn't, the blouse part of it, it was around there, and the cats played with that.
Did they have puff sleeves in those days?
Big puffy sleeves, yeah.
And she wore a hat, you say, when she was married?
No, it was a hair ornament.
A hair ornament.
But it was made of orange blossoms. And however they were made, I know that they were dipped in some kind of wax. And I can remember that little headpiece in the trunk, and we'd take it out and play with it and wear it.
And you say she was buried with that?
No.
Not that headpiece.
No, not any. All of the wedding was the skirt.
The skirt.
Because she had a nice white blouse in the casket.
Okay.
I know a plain white blouse, which was just very nice. But the black skirt was part of her burial. And that was then in 1915. So you see that it was about 17 years later. And I know that whenever she was dressed up, she wore that skirt.
Uh-huh.
It was a very nice skirt. And I remembered it had a black frill around the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you another question. If they were married at your grandfather's farm or grandfather's house, then did your parents live with your grandparents, or did they get their own home?
No, you see, it was Anders Bengtson's location, and he lived with them.
His wife was dead.
She died
in Sweden. Yes.
2 weeks before they came to this country.
So in other words, your mother, the new bride, moved in with your father in their home, and they shared the home with Anders. And of course, see, George was 3 years old. George could just barely remember grandfather. And the reason why he had a pretty fair memory was that Dad had bought a separator. I don't know what the old style of farm machinery was like, but at any rate, George remembers going out with his grandfather, and they looked to see it working. Now that was the day he died.
And later in that day, in the evening hours, he died.
And that would have been in 91 maybe, or 92?
No, it would have been, he died in 1901.
No.
No, 91. 91. So, and I think that it had to be in the late summer, undoubtedly.
Of 91. And George is only 3, but he remembers that.
That he had a memory of that. And Dad and Mother's birthdays were both in September. And so you see that when they were married in August, and then their birthdays come right afterwards. Dad's birthday was the 4th, and Mother's was the 19th of September. And another interesting fact was that when Joanne was born on the 4th of October.
That was Anders' birthday.
That was Anders' birthday. So that she was, I think, 120 years younger than he, something like that.
Did you say he was born in 1820? Anders? I think.
You know,
I think you told me.
I had that picture here, and I sent it to your sister in Pennsylvania
Catherine.
Just yesterday, because I was going to send it to her at Christmas time, but I never got around to it.
I think, now your dad was born in 1860. I think you said your grandfather was born in 1820. And see, your dad was one of the youngest of the children.
The what?
Your father was one next to the youngest of the children. Jenny was younger.
Jenny was younger, yes.
The youngest of the
there were no children younger than that.
August was much older.
August was 12 years older than Dad. And Aunt Christine, the oldest sister that lived, was 5 years older than Dad. But then beyond her there were 2, August, and then there were 2 sisters, Britta and Anna-Britta.
We talked about those.
They died in their early 20s.
Both of those?
Both of them. One died having a child.
They lived in Texas, I think you said.
They were living up in Houston, Minnesota.
Houston, Minnesota.
See, that was where...
You talked about a Pete.
That was where Pete Bengtson lived Pete was Dad's cousin.
Okay, yes.
Uh-huh.
I don't know why I thought Texas. I was wrong.
They, and I have never been there, so we can't orient anything to that. The only one of the family was Pete and his daughter, I forgot her, who was a cousin of Emma and Nellie and Herbert and Carl. Those were our second cousins, so Pete Bengtson was our second cousin also.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there anything else you want to visit about your mother's side of the family and your grandmother and grandfather?
Well, I imagine that I might think of things.
Can you?
Before next Saturday.
Yes.
That I might want to add to that. But right now my mind is pretty blank.
Okay, you talked about John, the oldest boy.
Uh-huh.
Where did he locate, or did he move, or do you know much about him?
Well, I'll tell you. They used to speak about John with a kind of a funny smile. They always regarded him as an oddball. He was the oldest, and he married this Emma Carlson. And she was undoubtedly an oddball also. And the boys were Leonard and Victor, and the girls were Edith and Hannah and Hilma. I don't know if there was more than those five or not, but throughout the years, the ones that Edith and I got to know well, or fairly well, was the younger of the boys, Victor. We met Leonard, but he was married, and he died in the summer, just immediately after the First World War, because he was in service.
Oh.
And he came back, and
was he wounded, or did he get a disease?
he what?
Was he wounded in the war, or did he get a disease?
No, what happened to him was very simple. It was just an illustration of what an oddball he was. His hand was damaged by the roses, wild roses. He was scratched.
In Europe?
On the farm place at home.
After the war?
After the war.
Oh my word.
He was damaged. And they kept telling him that that's bad. You should see the doctor. Finally, he went to see the doctor. It was getting pretty bad then. And the doctor was busy and couldn't take him immediately. And he couldn't wait, so he went home. And after a couple of days he died.
Blood poisoning.
Blood poisoning.
Oh my. And who was this again?
That was Mother's oldest brother, John.
Oh, he died?
He died.
Fairly young man.
Yeah.
He had 5 children.
He had 5 children.
Where were they living then, Aunt Edna?
They were living about a mile. Grandmother lived there close to town, and I would judge that they possibly lived for 4 or 5 miles to the north, south, slightly southwest.
On a farmstead?
Uh-huh. On a farm.
Well, he would have been probably what?
And in that area was Uncle Fred.
Uh-huh.
And
Sanford, you mean? Sanford?
Sanford, yeah.
Okay.
He was not more than a mile and a half or so away from grandmother.
Approximately how old would John have been when he died? Can you give an estimation?
Well, I think that, see, we were in Colorado, and I think Uncle John died sometime in a period of time before 1910. I don't know exactly when.
Okay.
But the relatives said that John, they said, you know John, he couldn't wait on anybody. Everything had to go according to his directions. And when the doctor couldn't leave his other patients and see him, and he just wasn't about to wait.
Okay, if your mother was born in 1864, she was 4 years younger than your father. John may have been born about the time your father was born, like 1860. Approximately, possibly?
He was a little younger than my father. He might have been born in 61, or possibly as late as 62, but I don't know, but he was born.
Okay, so then you're...
And that Francie came next before Mother.
Yes.
And I don't know what time of the year, but if John and Sanford had both been born before September of
64.
1860.
64.
64. You see that they would have fit in there very nicely.
Well, then your parents could have been. Let's just speculate. Your grandparents were probably married around 1860 in Sweden.
They see some of those facts. Edith was able to gather some of those facts, and they are in those little books, scrapbooks that are in the assortment out there. Now, when you go to investigating there, you'll be surprised at the fact that you will find it repeated time and again.
Well, now it'll be of interest. I will be able to put it together easier. See, because I'll be looking for those dates.
Yeah, but you will. You'll be able to follow that, and you will notice then that since the family records were kept by several individuals, that and each one of these relatives, after they had made their books, they sent me copies. So you will find that there are 4 or 5 copies, Edith and these others, and David Nelson out in Colorado and his wife, they produced one. And David, of course, is Danny Nelson's brother. So that was in that side of the family. But they naturally went for the father's side. But on the mother's side, Hilding and Fern wrote one. And you remember Hilding and Fern.
Yes.
They've been here. That they produced one. I think Fern did most of the work. But at any rate, it's brought up, and she did a very sensible job. But that took care of the Nelson side particularly. Now, I haven't looked in those booklets for several years.
Okay, now this is off the subject a little bit, but Danny and David's father was Carl.
Carl.
And that was your cousin.
Carl, he was my second cousin.
Second cousin.
His mother was the lady that saw grandfather's picture on
above the mantle.
He was the youngest in that family.
And that was your father's cousin, this woman. First cousin.
Anna Nelson was Dad's cousin.
So Danny and I are third cousins. Danny Nelson and I are third cousins. Because you and Carl were
second cousin once removed.
And so he's my
third cousin.
Yes.
And then Carl wrote one, and he did it earlier, and then I think Edith had one, so that there should be at least 5 of those notebooks. Carl and Edith and David and
Fern
on
your mother's side.
Yeah, and one more. I think that there should be 5.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask another question about Gustav and Maria Helena in Sweden. Do you know what occupation he had in Sweden before they came here?
In Sweden, I'll tell you, Västergötland was a rather poor province, and there were several landholders that were very well to do, and most of them owned so much land that there was very little left over So that most of these people were well.
Would you say indentured servants almost?
They were like indentured servants, I think, all of them. And some owned a little property, but most of them, I think they leased it or rented it a little.
Okay, when I was in Sweden, I don't know if it was that province, but I was into a museum type area where it showed the big house, the owner's house,
Big manor.
and around that were just the very hovel sleeping quarters,
Yeah.
very straw and just unheated, almost just very, very primitive.
Yeah.
And then they ate their meals in the big house,
Uh-huh.
some of them,
Yeah.
and were able to get warm a little bit. And they were almost like slaves or servants. And that situation was in Sweden until almost the turn of the century, my mom was telling me.
Uh-huh.
Where the very, very wealthy, of course this was prevalent in all of Europe
Uh-huh.
during that time, in Germany and...
Mother would talk about the owners. Sometimes she'd say slut, which was the castle, the castle or the mansion.
How were they able to get enough money together to come to this country? Can you tell me?
Mother's, Uncle John came first, a year or two ahead of the rest of the family. And they corresponded, of course, back and forth, and they planned. Now, how in the world they were able to get together? Of course, this old ship that they went on, they were so eager to get passengers that I imagine that they sold their tickets pretty cheaply.
Mm-hmm. And of course the people taking passage were taking a risk.
Yeah, they were taking a big risk.
On such an old ship.
But they did get to this country.
Mm-hmm.
But the boat never went anywhere after that.
They must have just scuttled the ship once it made it.
Well, it couldn't get an okay by any government. They wouldn't okay it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it took 16 days to
Well, that was remarkably fast, though, I would think, in those days.
Because after a while, you know, in 11 days, that was rather common.
For steamships.
And then they came on down a little less than that. No, it might have been longer than 16 days, but I'm not too sure of that.
Okay. And you say quite a few of your mother's people came then. It would have been your mother and your grandparents and other brothers and sisters. John was already here.
Well, I don't know that I know anything further about Mother's family, who came, how many of them came, because I know the pictures that I have here. I'll look and see if I can find the pictures of Margaret Roundtree. Her father was son, or her father might have been the grandson of one of the first of the young men who left Sweden in order to escape the draft.
Oh.
And that there were several in the family that did. Now, some of those we know landed in the Central States, in Chicago and elsewhere. Some of them went out to the West Coast, and in the process of time, Carl, my brother Carl, met up with one of the men relatives. Now, just offhand, I can't say too sure of who this man was. If he was, I might be able to think about it and give a better reply next week. But this one, I think was the child that was born to Britta or Anna-Britta, whichever it was, that when she died.
Oh.
And he grew up, and when he was a young man at 16, 17, he went out to Washington.
And that was your first cousin?
Yeah. You
Okay.
see. And Carl, if Carl met him in Bainbridge Island or somewhere else, or if it was his son that Carl met, I rather think it just had to be his son. I'm not sure at all there. But Carl did come in contact with the relative that had gone. Now some of the others, they went to California, but they were mostly on Dad's side. They were, well, this
is on your dad's side.
Was, on Dad's side also. No, it's so precious little that we know about Mother's side of the family, excepting the immediate family that settled in Denell and scattered there.
Okay, you made the remark that some men came over here to escape the draft. But they came for other reasons, didn't they? Economic reasons? And they wanted to escape from this indentured servantry?
Yeah, they did.
And they wanted religious freedom?
They wanted all of those, they all worked in together. And the Swedish people, you know, those old patriarchs, those pastors, were just intensely religious. And they weren't the shifty kind of people that we have at the controls today.
Didn't they also kind of guide the immigrants and help get the people over to America?
Yeah, each one of them, much like Dr. Olson here, would get a group together and they'd work together.
I'm going to ask again, if these were indentured servants, did the wealthy landowners evidently just let them go? Or?
Well, I think that these well-to-do men in Sweden thought that if these young men were eager to make a new life in the United States, that it wasn't up to them to stand in the way at all. I think that it wasn't difficult to get away. I think that they approved their movement.
Evidently, there were immigrants from all provinces of Sweden at that time, were there not? And of course, other countries in Europe, Ireland and Germany, and
the countries also.
Norway, because there were a lot of Norwegian settlements.
But there was this religious growth, sudden growth in Sweden from 1860 to 1885, I think, maybe a little later. But they were people that was well stirred by these good old religious leaders that guided the people in Sweden. That's one thing that all of those that I know something about, they were men of a different caliber than what we see now. There aren't very many of the men that you read about that are up to that standard, at least not in my estimation. It's quite sad. It really is sad because I don't know what there is if they are so given. It's just like we were talking here about the ladies that worked down here in this building. You know, it wasn't. There's a law that's still on the books. It's never been repealed because nobody would be senseless enough to do that. That women that worked with food had to have their hair inside a net. Look what we have to put up with. They have, their hair stands out, kinky and curly all over their back. They are just so ridiculous. The clothes they wear, the waitresses and those had to wear acceptable clothes. Now, the crazier they look, the more progressive they are. That's one reason why I'm sick and tired of living. But these younger generation, they can't understand that. They have no taste of what I knew growing up. And I could name a number of the men in this area besides Dr. Olson. And in Iowa there was a gentleman, Pastor Norbum, and in Minnesota, the names don't come to me very readily, but each area they had some outstanding leaders. We don't have those anymore. And Dr. Chilstrom, who is the top man in the Lutheran Church of America, Cousin Eleanor, Hilding's sister, said to me some years ago, she has no high regard for that man. He was the president of the Minnesota Conference. Now all of this will be recorded so somebody will hear it later on and they'll take exception to it. They don't want to hear it. So I don't want to say too much, but I do want to give just a slight idea that those of us who lived at this time could foresee things were going to pop pretty badly. Is that sufficient?
Well, that's fine. You should I want you to voice your opinion.
How?
I want you to voice your opinions because you lived in a different time than now, so you have a right to express your feelings of how it was. And so,
well,
that's fine.
It makes me very unhappy. And of course, that doesn't really belong here, but you know that I haven't been able to go to church for 3 years. But I have an awful good pastor right down here in our chapel. But we don't follow the church regulations like the church year and that. But the sermons that he gives is law and order, very fine. And you know Pastor Hawk well enough to know that he's a superior person and that we are well pleased with what we have. And we are so fortunate to have the leadership that we have of these men that are here. But I can't say very much for some of the workers. Now you know that Linda worked here and she wasn't mistreated, but she was treated in an ugly fashion by some people. Now, I don't care to bring that in either.
We'll go on to something else.
Yeah.
I think let's just change subject now, because if you should think of some other things about your mother's side, we can talk about it. Last week we were talking about the school, Pella School, and it was very interesting.
Yeah.
And Edna, I'm going to take a little break for about 5 minutes and we'll come back. Is that okay? We'll just take a little break and we'll be right back.
That'll be all right.
Okay, we're back now, and
back in line.
we're back in line. And last week we were talking about your Pella School, which was west of your house. I think you said about a mile.
A little over a mile, slightly over a mile. It was about a mile to Fristrom's place, and this was just at the west edge of that.
Okay. You were going to talk about a day at school, an average day at school, as you recollected. Would you talk about that?
About what?
An average day at school, just an ordinary school day. What you did, the games you might have played.
Miss Davis, of course, drove out from town, and she was always there between 20 minutes to a half an hour early. She never was late to anything.
Your school started at 9, did you say?
And we, the McCaslins and Forbuses to the west, and then there were a few outlying places here of the beet tenders' families. Over this way there was several nice farm places. The Pews lived up this way, and then over here was the Johanssons, and farther away, the only one that I can remember came from the south was Alfred Olden. He was Norwegian, and his he was George's age. And then a year or two afterwards, the Weishaupels came there. And they were German, of course. And there was quite a few children, 6 or 7, I'm sure. And they weren't Swedish and they weren't high society like the Swedes were.
Oh, really?
They were German. Russians, no. And you know...
Well, you say German and Russian. What do you mean?
Well, I'll tell you. From history, and I learned it from them. Back there in the last century, a lot of the people in Germany found, for various reasons, that they should move into one of the other provinces, and they moved possibly farther east or closer to the center of things, and they thought that they were in better locality. Now I can remember when the Weishaupels, one of the older ones, I think the girl said, "We ain't Russians." She didn't like when they called them Russians. She said, "We are German."
Okay, the Germans had immigrated into Russia.
They had gone into Russia.
Now, Edna, I'm going to ask a question. Some of the Mennonites went to Russia to avoid the draft in Germany. Is that not true?
I think that's
And
true.
so that's why they immigrated from Russia, but they were Germans.
Yeah.
Okay. So now I remember George talking about the Russian family, but he must have been talking about the Weishaupels.
It could have been the Weishaupels. There was the Starkbeins, but the Starkbeins were genuine German. They lived across the road from McCaslin's, right, slightly west of, slightly to the north, about a quarter of a mile from the schoolhouse, maybe a little bit more.
Okay, so he referred to them, the Weishaupels or someone, he referred to them as Russians, even though they were not. They immigrated from Russia.
Yeah. So that they were all of German background.
Okay.
But we, most of us, we didn't pay any attention to that. If the rest of the crowd in school called them Russians, so did we. If they said they were Germans, so did we. You see, that we knew something about Swedish history and the situation in Sweden and the people that wanted to leave Sweden and come to the United States for better living conditions. So I think that all of these Germans and Russians or whatever they were people that left Europe in order to better themselves in some fashion. Sometimes political, sometimes financially. And sometimes it was church. And there again, a lot of these people had been, they had been touched with Lutheranism or some of the other Protestants, and they were not eager to remain Catholic. Although we had some Catholics in the area, and I don't think that they were ever mistreated in any way whatsoever. Miss Davis had a profound ability to treat every student on an even keel. She was kind to all.
Even though she had strong political beliefs?
But politically, that was another matter.
Okay, I want to ask some other question. In the Pella School, there were a lot of ethnic backgrounds in. There was the Germans, there were the Swedes. You talked about Irish, McCaslins? Okay, did these people, now like the German, they spoke German in their home?
Well,
the Swedes spoke Swedish in their homes. Were there any other nationalities?
Well, the Oldens that lived on the Weishaupel place, they were genuinely Norwegian.
Okay.
And then up near the Spencers was one of the Froland families, and they were Norwegians. And then farther on, Johansson's, Mr. Johansson spoke fluent Danish. And I don't think that his family could, Louise or any of them could understand any Danish, because I think Mrs. Johansson wasn't Swedish, wasn't Danish. Then coming farther over, there was the Davies family. They moved in to the Lichty place. The Lichtys were, I think, one of the Mennonite sects, or they might have been, they might have been Quakers. But at any rate, they were of a sect, and they were very fine people, and they lived about a little more than a half a mile west of us, a little more than about 2/3 of the distance between us and Pella School.
What was their name again?
Lichty, Lichti.
Mm.
Lichty.
So there were, at homes in the area, there were their own language. Now, did this ever creep up in school? In other words, in school, you spoke English, of course, but I mean, did you speak Swedish to your brothers sometime in school?
I think that if we wanted to say something, Edith especially, she could do that very nicely.
And did some of the family speak Norwegian in school, or Russian, or I mean German? Do you recall?
I don't think, as far, I wasn't too cognizant of any problems like that, although I know very well that it existed, that family came first.
Do you recall if there was any prejudice in those days, bigotry?
What?
Bigotry or prejudice? Did you feel that?
I don't know. I know that we as children knew that we were different from other people, and our church affiliation was different. And of course ours was it. Mm-hmm. And the others, we felt sorry for them because they weren't as wise as we were.
You felt that yours was the only way? Did you feel that way?
I never felt that there was anything compared with ours.
No, but you didn't feel that yours was the only.
No.
Now
no,
see, some sects, Edna, feel that way.
No, I don't think, I think that was made clear to us. But
can I ask you this? Did you feel just fortunate, or did you feel better than others? Or both?
I don't know. I don't think that felt in terms of, I just felt that there was a difference.
Uh-huh.
I don't think that I put anybody on different levels.
They were different. In other words, the Norwegians and the Germans, maybe they felt they were different, of course.
Well, of course, the McCastlins and all of the Irish, whether they were Catholics or Methodists, it didn't matter. They were it.
In their thinking.
In their thinking, and they treated the rest of us in such a fashion.
But isn't that human nature?
That what?
Isn't that human nature?
Sure, it is.
And you, Edna, in your teaching, you taught in some backgrounds. You talked about Hollenberg. You had different nationalities. When you taught in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, that you encountered the same thing, didn't you?
They never, my students never felt that I was sold completely on anything.
You were liberal and broad-minded toward the Catholics.
Yeah.
Now, Edna, Uncle George, I want to just share some things. I remember from a young boy, he talked about the Russians in Colorado. There must have been some Jewish families, because I remember George, and bless his soul, I'm not running him down, but he taught me to be afraid of anyone that wasn't Swedish Lutheran. Now, why was this? He didn't like Catholics, he didn't like Jews, he didn't like Mormons, he didn't like...
No.
Why? Can you tell me why?
I know as a child, I wondered myself at George.
Had he been hurt by someone?
I don't know that he was. It never came to my attention in that way that I had to come to a conclusion of any kind. I sometimes wondered, but I never knew.
You didn't try to argue with his point of view?
No, I don't. But I always I can remember as a little child when he got argumentative, I got irritated. I almost felt like saying, "Oh, shut up."
Well, don't you feel, my observation, isn't it not correct?
That what?
Isn't my observation correct about Uncle George?
I think so.
I tried to be tolerant and listen.
Uh-huh.
But I remember in that thinking, he was very, very set in his way.
Well, I've often wondered about that. George was so positive. My dad wasn't.
And my dad wasn't that way.
No, the rest of the family. But George and Carl, to a certain extent, they must have had a pastor in Sunday school at some time.
That preached some weird thinking?
Pastor Seashore or somebody. I don't know that, previous to that we had Landale and others. But I can't figure out at all where George got that. But I know that there was a strong tendency of that in the Nelson family.
Your mother, they may have picked up from your mother's side.
Uh-huh.
Because my father never showed bigotry, Edna, toward anyone, as I can recall.
No.
But George virtually preached to me not to trust anybody that wasn't Lutheran. He did.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
He told me never trust a Jew. He said never trust this and that.
See,
did he have a bad experience with a Jewish person?
The Jews, they were mostly peddlers that came out from Denver.
Oh.
And they'd come out and buy cattle or trash or anything and then bring it back to Denver and sell.
Mm-hmm.
So that they were peddlers.
They were traders. They didn't own much property, did
No. No. And to us, more or less, we just kind of joked about them, laughed about them.
Were they troublesome, or?
They, I can't remember that any of us ever had any trouble with them.
Mm-hmm.
It's strange that way. But George, I think if you would have been around George and Uncle Frank,
mm-hmm.
and would have heard their conversations, I think that they thought and talked alike.
Okay, so Frank would have maybe influenced George.
I think that there might have been some influence there.
Uh-huh.
And Adelida, she was with the boys those months in Iowa, and she was around quite a little bit, and I know that she was somewhat bigoted. I can just feel that,
mm-hmm.
that I didn't agree with what she was saying. As little as I was,
mm-hmm.
I wanted to say something, but I wasn't capable of carrying on any argument or anything.
How did Edith's views fit in this?
Edith never was a troublemaker. She was very attentive and listened. I think Edith was straight in her thinking, and she tried to keep quiet as much as possible. And she once in a while knew very definitely what was being said was entirely wrong.
In her opinion?
Then she would sometimes speak up.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was younger, and I didn't speak up so often. It wasn't until I was out of school when I felt like asserting myself.
Mm-hmm.
But having lived with George, and after he grew older and didn't have any children of his own,
mm-hmm.
and as he grew older, if he'd had children of his own, he would have found that he would have had to talk to them and mellow
mm-hmm.
a little bit. But Esther wasn't an argumentative person.
No.
She knew what she believed, and she didn't believe anything different. And George and Carl, they must have had teachers both in Iowa, and their pastor, when we came out to Longmont, had Pastor Arlene and those. I think that they might have been somewhat bigoted in their attitude. But it never spilled over on me particularly. But I do know that what come to the time when I was in confirmation and we had Pastor Carlson, he was very, very, he came from St. James, Minnesota. And I don't know that I ever stopped to think that I felt argumentative. I didn't always feel like I accepted what he said, but I wasn't going to argue about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I have often wondered that to what extent George's, I don't know.
He was very strong in his
He was
beliefs.
very strong in it. And I know Mother was very strong in her opinions. So it must have come from the
Okay.
Nelson side.
Can I ask you something else? Last week you said that your mother tended to take your father's opinion on a lot of things. But now you're saying that she yet retained her own beliefs. You used to say that, or last week, I think you said that your father's opinion more or less held sway in the household. But your mother must have had her opinions.
Yeah, but she didn't argue.
Mm-hmm.
She sometimes would speak her piece.
Mm-hmm.
But Dad wasn't a person to put his wife down. He
No.
would listen,
Mm-hmm.
and he'd be considerate.
But he didn't change his opinions either.
But he didn't change his opinion
Mm-hmm.
any.
Mm-hmm.
But as time went on, and Dad and Edith talked a lot, Edith could have answered a lot of things. But as I got older and was teaching and all of that, Dad would listen to me.
Did your dad change as he grew older?
I think, personally, I think that when we got away from Longmont and we came to Lundsburg, the time came when he was annoyed with Dr. Virgin.
Is that what caused him to leave at the church?
Well, I think partly that, but he was so fond of Nels Olson for one thing. But I think that Dr. Virgin was very argumentative.
Very opinionated,
And
wasn't it?
nobody, don't disagree with me.
He was the doctrine. However he interpreted it, that's the way it was.
That's the way it was.
And your father was not one to accept
And
total.
he was equally strong in his belief, and he didn't agree with Dr. Virgin.
And their two strong men hit heads, even though they were friends.
They were friends. They stayed friends, but they disagreed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that they really came into any big arguments. Dad would sometimes question Dr. Virgin about something, but they never went into detail about anything.
Mm-hmm.
They just knew that they were different people and represented different ideas.
Okay, can we talk about that in the next few weeks when we get back to Lindsburg? But now can we just go back a little bit to the Pella era?
Go back to Pella?
Yeah, I keep digressing. It's my fault that we're moving all over the place. But these are things that are going to be fun to talk about.
Well, see, we came to the area at Christmas time,